And Professor Cardenas, could you kind of give a brief overview of how countries use sanctions and how they've used this as a diplomatic mechanism in foreign affairs and foreign policy?
First of all, I would like to thank the International Law section of the Houston Bar Association for inviting me to join this panel. Definitely, the use of sanctions is today part of all developed nations' foreign policy these days. Particularly, we may emphasize that it's part of also Petro diplomacy. To emphasize on that, I can mention three examples. And with that, we can see the two sides of the coin of this before we enter into the more specific practice of sanctions. The use of energy abundance, energy capacity by nations, by oil-producing nations, have been part of the Petro diplomacy. And I can use the example of Russia and Venezuela as an example, and also the case of the US to have a perspective of what is going on now. Russia, with its abundance of hydrocarbon resources, has created, with the consent of the Western Europe, that decided consciously not to develop their hydrocarbon resources, with the exception of Norway, the UK, and Denmark, have created this codependency, which the perfect example is the Nord Stream pipeline 1 and 2, with the number 2 being recently canceled as a consequence of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. But that was a way of how Russia used in its diplomacy, and Russian companies exercise power and influence through the use of hydrocarbons. In the case of Venezuela, you can see the case of Petrocaribe, an international agreement that was signed with 14 Central American and Caribbean nations that put Venezuela in a position to cooperate, to deliver to these nations about 400,000 barrels of oil a day in order to have an influence in the Organization of American States that more or less dominated for about 15 years, blocking the application of the Inter-American Democratic Charter against Venezuela. That was an example, or that was a moment in which Venezuela could use those resources. These days, under current prices and the current situation in Venezuela, Maduro is not in the capacity to support these countries under the current oil prices. And then now you see that in the OAS, the permanent representative of Venezuela is an ambassador appointed by Juan Guaido and not Maduro. So you take now the example of the US. By the way, the two previous examples are sovereign examples. It's examples of they are exercising their sovereignty, the use of their own resources in order to get influence in foreign policy. But now the US, turning the #1 producer of oil in the world, has no dependency whatsoever with Venezuelan oil, no dependency with Russian oil, and it put the United States in a position of power to implement economic sanctions against these nations when they are justified by arguments that you can see in the press and in a government statement in terms of the use, unjustified use of force in case of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, or the autocracy policies in Venezuela, violation of human rights, and corruption in Venezuela that have also created a number of set of sanctions against the country. So when we as lawyers or counsels in companies and law firms see this environment, we see an increasing practice of these sanctions that multiply not only in the United States, but also in other countries. We have in the form of unilateral sanctions. We have in the form of multilateral sanctions through the European Union and United Nations when the Security Council approved this type of regulation. So you have a more practice dealing with this prohibition of doing businesses or these bans.
Well, kind of piggyback off of that, Professor Cardenas, can you kind of explain, I guess, the initial difficulties with countries like Venezuela and Iran that currently have sanctions? What were those sanctions? We don't have to go too deep into detail, but I guess what sanctions are currently in place, and how does the U.S. kind of balance? Okay, we have sanctions in place for Iran and in Venezuela, but we have this crisis in Ukraine and Russia. How do I balance that? How do I say, you know what, we're going to lift these and keep this going in against Russia?
Yes, Danny, there was a public debate. It was in the press early in March with a visit of a delegation from the U.S. government that met with Maduro, and that created a whole discussion in media about whether the U.S. was thinking to replace Russian oil with Venezuelan oil. That created all type of debates and articles and opinion with regard to that visit. I remember being in Europe, in Spain, about 3 weeks ago, and comments in Europe were like people consider the U.S. foreign policy that was against their own statements. Having the construction of a foreign policy with regard to the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and then turning to recognized autocrat in South America to replace that oil. So that created a whole debate in terms of lifting sanctions, keeping sanctions, and then you have Iran included in the discussion because again there have been the Department of State have been for the last year during the last year in negotiation with Iranian government to try to take back the nuclear deal and to reach an agreement to lift sanctions against Iran. But part of the discussion is whether they have to take out of the list of terrorists the Iranian Guard Corps, and that created a lot of tension in U.S. politics in order to accept to that request. As Brad was mentioning, Iran is in a position to respond to international supply of oil, which is a different case with Venezuela that is under a different crisis, different conditions. Iran had been under sanctions for decades, and they developed know-how that or how to bifurcate, how to work with a world that is not connected with the U.S. Financial system, and even know-how from Iran had been helping Maduro in Venezuela to work or to navigate in these uncharted waters for Venezuelans in recent years. So, of course, there are two ways to approach approach this from on legal terms. One will be with the idea of lifting sanctions. So you change, you overturn that U.S. law that applies to Iran or Venezuela, or you also approach this through the practice of licenses, which is also a practice that sanctions regimes are bringing. So you have more law firms and more companies applying for special licenses, or they benefit in the application of general licenses that allow some companies to continue doing businesses with these countries. Licenses are also part of the interest of the foreign policy. The U.S. have kept these sanctions against Venezuela, but had kept a license, a general license that allows Chevron, Halliburton, Schlumberger, and Baker Hughes to continue keeping operations in Venezuela. And that license can be open, I mean, in terms of time with no deadline, or it can be as a general license that favor these companies in Venezuela that have a term, and that term has been extended over time. So the practice of license had been also part of the legal services that are now more and more common being requested in terms of not only prepare a company for the submission of license requests, also for the interpretation of license, also on how to perform activities under these licenses in order not to breach one of the sanctions that had been imposed. But what had been interesting after the crisis in Ukraine is the change of the position of the German foreign policy. That it actually failed in that tenet of saying to the world, we can separate business from politics. We can continue doing businesses with Russia, with this Nord Stream pipeline number 2, and we will know how to handle Putin. Well, guess what? That tenet is not longer can be sustained in front of the international community. The international community is shocked by the images of this invasion that is not only targeting or is a special operation that Vladimir Putin is engaged, is a war that has already the International Criminal Court inside of Ukraine, doing already investigations for crimes against humanity in Ukraine. So you have this change in the German foreign policy that had also dragged the European Union, that just this week is discussing again about bans in oil imports, not gas, which is they are more dependent on gas than oil. And of course, it's a different market, a different ways of transportation that provide more flexibility for oil. But you have the change also in the position of Switzerland, that breached years, decades of neutrality. You have more countries to involve in terms of sanctions. The UK with sanctions at a level that in many cases are with higher standards than the US. You have Australia, you have Canada also engaging in sanctions regime. So we for the studies of foreign policy, you can be shocked about what is going on. We have been in 30 years ignoring that values can be part of foreign policy. We are in a pragmatism that have been even promoted from the White House in recent decades, and then we're backing with narrative of against terrorism, against corruption, supporting democracy, and supporting the respect of human rights. And then you have new regulation that is backed by this narrative.
Speaking on Latin America, we just spoke about Venezuela and those sanctions. Looking at a broader scope of Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, where do you predict, well, because of these sanctions on Russia and because of the current situation in Venezuela, where would you predict that there would be an increase in production sent to the U.S., if any of these other Latin American countries that you wouldn't expect?
After the sanctions were announced, was visiting here in Houston President Duque from Colombia. Was here in Houston, and after the visit in Houston during the Syria week, he went to DC. Colombia offered Colombian oil. Mexico, I'm sure that I have no doubt that Pemex people will providing the same offer to provide supply to the U.S. I will be more than happy to do it. But as I agree with Rad analysis, I think that may be covered with internal market. It's not a problem of getting access to those. The U.S. will have multiple options to do it, and it's not necessarily this is not an administration that looks thirsty for Venezuelan oil. Let's put it that way. Now it's a different market, a different position, different type of politics, and a very complex situation in Venezuela, not only in terms of the politics that are very complex, but also in terms of the current state of Venezuelan oil industry. The destruction and the lack of investment, the number of costs in environmental liabilities that the country has been going through, particularly in the last 3 years, is critical. So any new investment that will come, particularly in the case of Venezuela, will require a change, not only to a system of better rule of law and sanctity of contract. It will require new legislation, new institutions to have credibility to companies being engaged in new investment. But again, it's probably even a question that is not in the chessboard. There will be other countries and companies that it will make the transaction easier instead of going to a geopolitical crisis, licenses, more sanctions. Same with Iran. You have countries without those regimes that will be eager to do businesses with the United States.